I thank you and Sharon for the invitation to speak here on the history of the, actually on the beginnings of the European-Israel collaboration, which started with the German-Israeli collaboration, which is very clear. And dear Professor Rüttgers, dear Professor Vogel, I'm very happy to speak here at the same conference, and I really appreciate what you said, and I hope we have the time to discuss it, because I'm also very worried about the post-truth society in science, what happens in science, because it affects also what is going on in science, but that's not what I was invited to talk about. Okay, so the beginnings of the Israeli-German collaboration in the sciences. The Israeli-German relationship has been in the headlines in Israeli newspapers for a couple of days, marginalized only by the news about the fire. And it also reached the social media, and this is a picture which I was sent because I am not on Facebook or anything, and it relates to the submarine project, the submarine deal of Netanyahu with ThyssenKrupp. And the point made here is, Solelet means in Israel submarine and female diver. So this was sent around to just make fun of this deal, which is actually not so funny. And this reminded me that a secret weapons deal between Israel and Germany was actually the beginning of the relations between the two countries. And it also ended in a scandal in 1964 when it became public. It was brought about by the defense ministers Shimon Peres and Karl Josef Strauss. And yeah, as I said, that was really the beginnings. And it was followed by the 1952 reparations agreement, Heskem Hashilumim, which is anything but the Wiedergutmachung, but that is the German term for it, which was concluded by Ben-Gurion and Konrad Adenauer, again against strong opposition in both Israel and Germany and from the Arab states. Yeah, so then in 1965 was the establishment of the diplomatic relations, and the scientific relations, or let's say the initiation of the scientific relations, started even before the establishment of diplomatic relation, and namely in 1956. And my goals here are to present the initiators and demonstrate their scientific and political rationales in a time that was really adverse to any kind of collaboration. Second, to demonstrate the moral costs of the collaboration. And third, to point to the role that this collaboration played in the integration of Israeli science into the framework of European science. I should say here that Germany here refers exclusively to the Federal Republic, the old West Germany, because the GDR, the politics of the GDR was shaped by strong anti-Israeli movements, partly because of the Cold War and its integration in the Soviet realm of power. So, some words of the historical and political background. One important point was that German scientists were internationally quite isolated after 1945 for a long time. There was no official boycott as had existed after the First World War, but still there was no normalcy, and German scientists were shunned, not invited as a group, and people didn't want to come to Germany from other countries, and former refugees also didn't want to have to do with them, except for exceptions, of course. And this isolation severely affected German science, particularly in new areas of research. And Israel went further. It was the only country to impose a complete cultural boycott on Germany. And I quote here Hanan Baron from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He said in a speech in 1997 that since the Holocaust, relations of Israel's Jewish population with Germany cannot be but problematic, is to state the obvious, yet the depth of the abyss that prevailed in the 40s, 50s, and 60s is, even in 1997, not easy to imagine. Neither diplomatic nor cultural ties existed between the two countries. All Israeli passports were marked valid for all countries with the exclusion of Germany. visits were unheard of, and so on. There were more political obstacles to a collaboration. I mentioned the so-called reparations agreement, but this forbade explicitly the establishment of cultural ties, and that was reinforced by the Knesset after the Eichmann trial in 1961. Then there was the Hallstein Doctrine, then the crisis due to German missile experts in Egypt. It was a big, major crisis between the two countries. And the existence of a strong pro-Arab faction in the West German Foreign Ministry, which also was not favorable to a collaboration. And so here I come now to the almost impossible idea of initiating the collaboration long before the diplomatic relations were shaped. And I want to first mention some inaccurate accounts which are widespread, namely that the Max Planck Society under Otto Hahn initiated contacts with Israel in 1959. But this cooperation was not initiated by the Max Planck Society or German scientists. They couldn't have done it. I mean, it was impossible. Or scientists who wanted to revive the fruitful collaboration with former German Jewish colleagues, as was written by the Ministry of Education and Research. But the fruitful collaboration with former German Jewish scientists, which were mostly in the United States, England and Turkey, was not revived. Those refugees were not asked to come back to have the same positions in Germany. And German Jewish scientists in Israel did not participate in the early collaboration. The first step to the collaboration was made, in fact, by an Israeli scientist already in 1956. And this is almost a detective story, and I have not the time to go deeply into it, just mention it, that this scientist was the chemist Gerhard Schmidt from the Weizmann Institute. He visited in Germany in 1956 for private reasons, and this is a story. I mean, his mother was Jewish, and they had to escape Germany. But his father was not. He stayed in Germany, and he became member of a Nazi party. And his son refused for many, many years to visit him. But after he became full professor at the Weizmann Institute, the first time he visited his father, and he urged him to see some German scientists, among them Wolfgang Gentner, of whom he said he is above any political approach, which was widely known at the time. And Gentner was a research center at CERN in Geneva, and later became a professor at the University of Heidelberg and the director of the MPI over there in nuclear physics. And Schmidt, after this meeting, Schmidt urged his colleague, Amos de Shalit, he was a nuclear physicist, and at the time also at CERN, to visit Gentner in his office at CERN, because he said there is something which we should do. And this visit of Amos de Shalit and Gentner was actually the beginning of the collaboration, as was later stated by the president of the Weizmann Institute, Harari, namely that the exchange between Professor Wolfgang Gentner and Amos de Shalit was to lay the foundations of the scientific collaboration between the two countries. I should also mention that de Shalit and many of his colleagues insisted that only non-Nazis or young Germans participate in the collaboration. So we can ask what were their motives, especially what was the motive to act against the boycott, which was still imposed against Germany. Schmidt was very much intrigued to cooperate with German chemists. German chemists had a very high level of science, and in particular to establish connections to chemical industry. And he was one of those people who supported strongly translational chemistry in Israel, founding companies and so on. De Shalit, his motives are more diverse. He was interested in Israeli science building strong international ties, including with Europe, at that early beginning already. And it was stated in the minutes of a meeting with German science. Professor de Shalit explained that Israel had tried many a time to be accepted into CERN without a veil, as the contention had been that Israel was not part of Europe. However, Israel was greatly interested in being involved in the scientific, cultural, economic, and other activities in Europe, and attempts to achieve this goal continue. So the vision of Europe was already there in the 1950s. And also de Shalit was close to Ben-Gurion, and he believed his claim, I think it came from Adenauer, of a new Germany. So it was not the continuation of the Nazi Germany. Of course, in the beginning, the material aspects was very, very important for the Israeli scientists because the economic hardship was tremendous. Gentner, as he wrote, he wanted to overcome the international isolation of German science. He spoke of the boredom in the science enterprise of today in Germany, and also the constraints, for example, on atomic research imposed by the Allied Control Council laws. So generally, we can say on the German side, the goal was to overcome this international isolation and the constraints, and then later to promote complementary research in areas that were not sufficiently developed in Germany, for example, molecular biology. On the Israeli side, as I said before, the short-term goal was to enhance research infrastructure, gain financial support, and establish contact with chemical industry, or chemical research at universities and industry. And the long-term goal was to have Israeli science internationally integrated into the framework of European science. So, nice goals and very motivated individuals, but they knew exactly they couldn't proceed without political support. And the way how they gained it is also very interesting. I can only mention it very briefly here. And also they had to overcome the strong opposition at the Weizmann Institute towards any collaboration with Germany. So in the years 58 to 59, they succeeded to receive political support through the involvement of Joseph Kohn. He was very instrumental. He was a social scientist graduating from the University of Heidelberg and the European representative of the Weizmann Institute in Zurich. And he contacted a former friend of Adenauer's, a Jewish businessman, who helped pave the way to get close to Adenauer. And in the end, Adenauer and Ben-Gurion agreed to the cooperation. Actually, it was not even so. I mean, Ben-Gurion agreed on condition that it would not be published. It should remain secret. And Adenauer also had his motives. I think Dr. Borchardt mentioned it already, the geopolitical motive. The financial agreement with Israel would help repair Germany's credibility in the West and was easier than establishing diplomatic relations or supporting Ben-Gurion's proposal that Israel be accepted as member of NATO or the common market. Personal, that was stated by historian Konrad Gillesen, it was a way to express his personal gratitude to his Jewish supporters during the Nazi era, when Adenauer was replaced from office. Two Jewish people helped him, I mean also when his bank accounts were closed, helped him to make his living in the 1940s. So with Adenauer's help, now the Israeli scientists in Kuhn met with representatives of German industry, but these talks were not fruitful. Industry didn't want to help to support science collaboration. At the next step, Gentner, again with political backing, arranged a meeting with the president of the Max Planck Society, who was Otto Hahn, and that was in 1959. And they agreed that the German delegation visit the Weizmann Institute. This plan met, like all the plans to collaborate, with a strong objection from the executive board of the Weizmann Institute and also from the members, the scientists at the Weizmann Institute, many of whom were survivors running around with the Auschwitz numbers on their arms. And they could not imagine having any German scientists close to them. And still, the objections were overruled after some time, and the board agreed. And then in December 59, the delegation from the Max Planck Society visited the Weizmann Institute, which include Weizmann Institute, Technion, and the Hebrew University. It included Hahn, Lünen, and Gentner. And much has been written about it, so I don't say anything more, except to mention two things. Why was there such a rush? You know, it was arranged in 59, and already December 59 they came. Why did they not take more time to leave the people breathe and think about it? And the reason was that Hahn was to retire from his presidency of the Max Planck Society. Hahn was known as an anti-Nazi. He was not very sensitive to Jewish matters and to his former colleagues, Jewish colleagues in the United States, England, and so on. And he was severely criticized for this and for taking a nationalistic attitude and to forgetting about the past and behaving as we have only the future. But in Israel, there was nobody to criticize him. They knew he was not Nazi, and there were realistic politicians, and so on. At this level, they agreed. But his successor was also a Nobel laureate like Hahn, Adolf Butenandt, and he was known not only to have been a member of the Nazi Party and even anti-Semitic, but also being a very tough person to deal with. So the thing had to be arranged in 1959, and it was so far. The visit was very successful, according to the reports of all people involved, and a financial and political agreement was reached, but its implementation was then delayed by the administration of the Max Planck Society, which was then Butenandt and Telschow, the general secretary. Also during the Nazi era, he was a strong Nazi and a strong anti-Semite. And but they involved some statutory, I cannot pronounce this, problems. And in the meantime, the VW Stiftung, the VW Foundation, provided initial support. And only in 1964, the Minerva Agreement, the first Minerva Agreement, was reached. And the Minerva Foundation became the legal basis for the funding of collaboration, funded by the German Ministry for Education and Research. So this was the 8 years after the initiation, though, this agreement was reached. And when we look just very broadly at this collaboration, a major part consisted of visits by young German scientists to the Weizmann Institute, and some years later also Israeli scientists to German institutions through Minerva grants. Then it was complemented by the Scholars Exchange Program that was funded until 1973 by the VW Foundation. And as a consequence, the activity of the Weizmann Institute in Europe, and especially in Germany, increased, despite the fact that most of the longer visits by scientists were to the United States. The first collaborative projects were in nuclear physics, chemical crystallography, and immunochemistry. There were no projects in genetics. I want to mention one aspect which I consider really maybe the most important aspect of the early collaboration, namely that the young German scientists who came to Israel were stimulated by new scientific approaches and the different research environment at the Weizmann Institute, and by international contacts. And I hope I have the time. I quote here one of them. This is Günther von Gehlen, from the who was at that time at the University of Heidelberg. He said, at the Weizmann, I interviewed many scientists on which I based this lecture. At the Weizmann Institute, virtually every week, international top physicists from leading institutions in the US and other countries came for a visit. Heidelberg could not compete with this. Germany was not the Germany of the 1920s anymore. And the liveliness, openness, and enthusiasm of the discussions were incomparable. He mentioned also the resistance against German postdoc level physicists. And he mentioned, and that has been supported by many others, that Amos de Shalit and Igal Talmi and others received us very warmly, and they tried what they could to help them, but the resistance could not be avoided. To come to the benefits and moral costs, so as I said before, Israel, that means in the beginning only the Weizmann Institute, later other institutions, the material benefit was, in this time of economic hardship, was tremendous. And then I learned from Steve Weiner at the Weizmann Institute, until today, the Israeli postdocs also were exposed to a different scientific culture. They had and have the chance to study the beneficial effects of efficient organization of research. I was happy to hear that in Germany. And then most importantly, the Germans did help Israelis to create strong ties with European scientific institutions and funding. And today, the EU is Israel's largest funding agency, even larger than the ISF, the Israeli Science Foundation, and larger, Herr Borchert, or I don't know who said before. I learned yesterday it was the largest. I learned it from Dan Blombeck from the Ben-Gurion University. I don't know, I'm not arguing on this, but he told me it exceeded now the others. Anyhow, it is very, very important, and certainly much more important than the bilateral support, which is also the Minerva Centers, Minerva grants, and the German-Israeli Foundation, which are important in certain areas, but quantitatively they are not so important anymore. Then the benefits for Germany. Israelis helped German science to be integrated in the European framework of science, I mentioned that, and young scientists benefited from the international atmosphere and less hierarchical way of conducted science, and they were able to make international contacts with prominent scientists. And I want to give here an example which in a way moved me. I talked to Michael Seller, who was long-standing director of the Weizmann Institute and in the second generation, one of the strongest promoters of German-Israeli and Israeli-European science collaboration. And he came from Poland, and large parts of his family were murdered during the war. And when I asked him why he was so involved in this, despite the fact that large parts of his family perished in the concentration camps, he replied, "I tried bona fide to help German science. I think that we should never forget about the past, but that we have also to plan for the future." And he went even so far as to collaborate for many years with a former SS member. And that nobody understands. Also other members of the Weizmann Institute don't. But he did not include him in the official collaboration, but on the personal level he collaborated with him. And I asked then Fritz Melchers, a German immunologist who was a postdoc at Seller's lab, what does it mean to help the young generation? He said, "I can tell you what helped me. We knew that we Germans had a problem internationally. We felt the aloofness towards Germans everywhere. To help meant to assist the younger generation in becoming accepted again internationally. Michael Seller said, this has to be changed, and it is to his great merit that he did it systematically." So this is one statement. So despite the benefits brought about by the collaboration, there was a price to be paid. And I want to mention also this price because somehow we should know. Israeli scientists had to pay a moral price by collaborating not only with non- or anti-Nazis or the younger people, but unavoidably also by institutions and individuals who had belonged to the Nazi power structure. It was impossible to organize the collaboration without, for example, Butenandt, Telschow and Globke. The collaboration was, in part, built on myths created by German scientists and adopted by Israeli scientists. I have examples for that. That many leading German scientists heroically resisted National Socialism and tried to educate their students after the war of what happened. It simply is not true. And then another price was that the collaboration did hurt the feelings of survivors and others affected by the Holocaust at the Weizmann Institute and later other institutions. In Germany, it's more difficult. The acceptance of a high-ranking Israeli institution as a partner so early after the Second World War helped the Max Planck Society and its leadership internationally to appear politically rehabilitated and immune in the face of critical questions. The myth that German scientists had heroically resisted Nazism and the the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, which was the predecessor of the Max Planck Society, was a victim of Nazi policy and not the partners in power of a totalitarian regime to its end, that they turned out to have been, were perpetuated. The examination of the Nazi pasts of German scientists and the Max Planck Society were delayed, but in the long run, the critical questions could not be avoided, and there have been now many, many publications initiated also by the Max Planck Society on to this effect. And I think in some cases also this went too far, but that's another story. I'm coming towards the end. Thank you. The political collaboration, politics and society, which is here the topic, I think, of the conference. So, to summarize, the collaboration was not initiated by politicians, but by individual scientists. It was an expression of needs and interests and the political vision of having Israel science integrated into the framework of Europe. It did not, as such, this is what I think, lead to an improvement in relations at the political level or to the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries. Political and military relations, in any case, had begun before the scientific relations. But still, it was important on the individual level. And just one word about the humanities, which started to collaborate only much, much later, only in the mid-70s to some large scale. That the reasons are that the Weizmann Institute did not conduct research in the humanities, and that in the 1960s there were no other initiatives. These three scientists were the only ones who made this, initiated this research. And Gabriel Motzkin from the Van Leer Institute said this year in a lecture, he said, Israelis in the humanities wanted to understand German Jewish history and its disastrous outcome. They were not interested in German culture, but Germans wanted to export German culture. Israelis growing up in the 1930s and 40s were interested in nation building. And only the next generation was ready to cooperate with Germans. I think this is not only true for many people in the humanities, but also in the sciences. And I think that the early cooperation of the Weizmann Institute was possible only because highly motivated, few individual scientists ran against the tide and succeeded in gaining political and financial support. These initiators, Schmidt and de Chalit and others, for example Sela, were committed to ideas which they considered beneficial for themselves and for Israeli science. The moral problems were not denied, but they were deemed secondary. The Israeli initiators and Gentner, this has to be emphasized, made every effort to address these problems in the best ways. Gentner selected the Germans very, very carefully before he let them go to Israel. And de Chalit went from lab to lab and asked the people whether they agreed to take on a German. If there was somebody who didn't agree, they didn't take anyone. So it was very, very carefully done. And I think the fact that all of them, each in their own way, at least tried to take responsibility was crucial for the success of the collaboration. And the results of that we can celebrate today. Thank you.